When a well-known and wealthy restaurant owner is confronted with his own mortality, it triggers a big change in him. To experience the difficulties faced by homeless people, he visits his restaurants as a homeless man without anyone knowing about it. With his final days upon him, he's looking to do a good deed. However, it can be difficult to figure out who should receive this gesture of kindness. To assess the hospitality of his staff, he came up with a plan to disguise himself as a homeless person and visit each restaurant. This would be an accurate way to test if they provided quality service or not. But even in his wildest dream, he could have never predicted what he would learn from his little experience, and it would change everything for John. John felt the nerves rage through his body. He had nearly visited all of his restaurants in the city and still had not found the person he was looking for. It all came down to this. He took a deep breath and stepped into the restaurant. When John entered the restaurant, any bit of hope he still had dissipated quickly. It was obvious that nothing was different here, and John was about ready to leave. He could barely hide his disappointment, but then he saw her and everything changed. For John, he had never expected it, but knew very quickly that this was the person he was looking. She was perfect, and John was ready to reveal everything to her. But who is this mysterious girl, and why was John looking for her? To better understand this, a bit of context is required. Hey, there are viral videos here. Before we go on like this video, smash the subscribe button and click the notification bell. We post the most beautifully amazing and scary videos every single day. Let's proceed with the video. John is a 78-year-old man whose life has been defined by his biggest passion, his work as an owner of a very luxurious chain of restaurants which are famous all across the country. But outside of his work in the industry, not a lot is known about John. John is a somewhat shy man who has been known to really value his privacy. People don't know if this is because he got something to hide or that it's just part of his personality, but looking deeper into his life in childhood, some possible explanations begin to arise. When John was growing up, he didn't have much time to make friends. His father was in the process of building up an empire in the world of fine dining, and because of this, the family was constantly moving all across the country and never stayed anywhere for long in this time. John grew to idolize his father very much, and he wanted nothing more than to follow in his footsteps. Almost everything he did was with this goal in mind, and there was barely any room for something else. But John never expected his chance to come so soon. When John was just 25 years old, he was still living with his parent at this time. His father got unexpectedly very sick, and his condition quickly deteriorated. It became clear that it would not be long before he was to pass in. A big decision had to be made, even though it was way earlier than the family had planned for. It was decided that John would be left in charge of the restaurants with his mother, keeping a watchful eye on. Not long after this decision, John's father sadly passed away. He was only 48 years old. John puts everything he's got into realizing his late father's dream, and he succeeds. He managed to make his restaurant chain a national success, and in the process he manages to make himself a lot of money. But this all does come with some big drawbacks, because John had been consumed by work for the last 50 years and was still fairly shy. He had no real friends at the moment, and besides that, most of his family had either passed away at this point or he wasn't in contact with. John was very alone, and besides not having any friends or family, John also had not been in any kind of romantic relationship for many years now. Most of the women he had been with only liked him for his money, and John was done with. He only wanted to focus on his work, and this laser focus on making his business a success made John a lot of money. He had inherited a very good restaurant chain from his father, but John's own ideas and influence really took the business to another level. It was all he ever wanted, but he would eventually come to regret his commitment. By this point, John is 72 years old, but despite this, retirement is not on his mind whatsoever. He still ever is committed to improving the success of his restaurants, but fate has a big surprise for John that will completely change any and all short-term plans. John had been feeling increasingly under the weather lately, but he was still able to ignore it for the most part. He never liked taking time off to visit the doctor and wanted to avoid it unless it was absolutely necessary. But sadly, this would very soon become the case. One day, John woke up with a stomach ache that nearly completely incapacitated. He saw no other option but to call an ambulance to transport him to the hospital. Here, a doctor did a full checkup on John to find the cause of his pain, and he came to a very sad, worrying conclusion. John was dealing with an infection that was in a fairly advanced stage. Because he waited so long with seeing a doctor, the infection had a lot of time to grow out of control, and by this point there was nothing any doctor could do to cure. John was informed that while the doctor could not give him an exact date, that he did predict that it would be a matter of months, if not weeks. John got a lot of medication to help him stay home pain-free for as long as possible, but eventually he would have to come to a hospital to spend his final days. On the way home, John started to reflect on his life and the decision that he had made. Along the way, a feeling of sadness and regret started to creep upon him. He realized that he had wasted his life on this earth just chasing financial gain. He started crying uncontrollably. John had made so much money in his lifetime, but never had somebody to share it with. It had just been collecting dust in possession of and with his end coming soon, he had nobody to leave his fortune to, but John decided to make a drastic decision. John had been a cheapskate all his life, so to compensate, he decided that he would donate at least half of his vast fortune to a variety of charities. But now there was still the question of what he was going to do with the rest of his money and with his many restaurants in about the last 2 decades. The only people John had been close with were the senior staff members of his restaurants and more, specifically the restaurant managers. He rarely spoke any other personnel as them seeing. He had no time for that. Could they be worthy or inheriting his money? The more John thought about it, the more he started to wonder if he actually knew these men. John wanted his money to go to people who were kind of hard, as he felt like they would be able to use it for good. But how could he test if his managers fit these criteria? After discussing a plan with somebody he hired to take care of his will, John came up with that. He decided to dress up as a homeless man and visit his own restaurants to see how the managers and other employees would react to him. In John's hometown alone, he owned 3 different restaurants. This is where he would start his experiment. He first went to his biggest restaurant that was known in the entire state, but the way his employees treated him there gave him tears in his eyes. He walked into the restaurant and very quickly John received strange looks from both guests and staff, because it's not very common, of course, for a homeless man to just walk into an expensive and fancy restaurant. So it didn't take long for the manager to come up to him, and he was fuming. The restaurant manager demanded that the homeless man immediately leave the restaurant. John told him that he was starving and hadn't had a good meal in days, but the manager wasn't having any of it. He had John escorted out the back door quickly on his way out. Even the chef shouted that if he was hungry, he could find yesterday's leftovers in the trash can behind the restaurant, and then it would still be the best meal he has ever tasted. John was deeply disappointed with his staff and hoped his luck would change in other restaurants. John decided not to reveal his true identity yet and went on to visit his other famous restaurant that was located a few miles away. When he arrived at the restaurant, he had high hopes that he would be treated better here, but it went from bad to worse. When he opened the door, a waitress immediately came running at him and demanded him to leave. When he refused, she called her manager, who told him that he was not even allowed to get a drink in this restaurant. But John had come up with a plan. This time, John told the manager that he used to be a regular customer and that he was an old friend of the restaurant, but that his company had gone bankrupt and now he had nothing left. Then he said that if the manager would call the owner, that he would remember him. John already knew that he wasn't going to leave money to this manager either, but he wanted to at least give him a chance to realize his bad behavior. He was planning to pick up the phone when the manager would call the boss and then reveal his identity, but this didn't go to. The manager responded with laughter and lied to the homeless man that he was the owner himself and that he had better leave the restaurant quickly before he would call the police. John was deeply disappointed in his staff and the way they treated homeless people. John started to realize that this mindset of not giving a damn about homeless people was probably present in all of his restaurants. This may not be that surprising if you consider that all these restaurants are located in very luxurious areas. But this was no excuse for John. He had been planning to keep his restaurants in business when he was to pass away and give ownership to the managers in. He figured this would be a good way to thank them for their years of service, but after what he had experienced today, he wasn't so sure about this anymore. Maybe it had been a foolish decision to focus solely on expensive and luxurious restaurants. Maybe if he made the food more affordable, it would also attract and breed a different kind of employee. If you often deal with people who are lesser of you, might gain more sympathy for them. John figured, but before John was ready to make any drastic decisions, he decided that he would give one more of his restaurants a. It was the last one located in the particular city. And even though John didn't have much faith that he would get a different reaction, he still felt like he had to try. John was getting very afraid that his mission was a failure, and by this point, he was already considering donating all of his money to charity instead of only half. He also had half a mind to sell all of his restaurants. The managers didn't deserve a penny, and John would have loved to fire them on the spot. When he arrived, a security guard immediately came up to him before he even stepped. John felt his heart sink to his shoes. It became obvious that he would not be treated any different. Here again, John was ready to walk away disappointed, but this time things would be different. John had half a mind to reveal his true identity to the manager and tell him what he had just missed out on. But John also realized that if 3 of his restaurants reacted the exact same way to a homeless, but there also had to go some blame on him. The owner. For John, it felt like it was time to admit defeat. He didn't know what he was going to do next. He felt like it needed to make a big change in his business and personnel, but knew he didn't have enough time left on this earth for that. John just wanted to go home. Now, John decided to walk around the back of the restaurant. He had parked his luxury car there as to not draw any unwanted eye. When he walked around the corner, his eye fell on a girl who was sitting there on the sidewalk next to the restaurant. She was wearing a waitress uniform. Apparently, John had found the girl taking a break in the quiet of the alleyway. Sheen was eating her lunch when she noticed the homeless man. She asked him to come over. John was really surprised since this was the first person to notice him and be nice to him. The girl's name was Julia, and she had worked in the restaurant as a dishwasher for 6 months. Sometimes she was allowed to help out in the restaurant, and that was where her true passion lays. The pair got to talking, and Julia shared her sad past with John before coming to work at the restaurant. She had her own business, but because she had gone into business with a bad partner, her whole business quickly went bankrupt and she had nothing left. Not even her parents could support her in these difficult times to get her life back on track. She applied for a job as a dishwasher at the restaurant, but this was not where her passion lay. She dreamed of owning her own restaurant and putting smiles on people's faces. She had no idea yet what was in store for her. After telling her story, she asked the homeless man if he was hungry and if she could do anything. John told the girl that he just wanted to have a meal in the restaurant, but that all the other colleagues had treated him badly and disrespectfully despite not having much money herself. She insisted on giving John the last part of her lunch while he was eating. She shared stories about herself. During their conversation, John developed more and more sympathy for the girl and felt like he had finally found the right person. John was so overwhelmed that he decided to take off his disguise and revealed his real identity. The girl recognized the restaurant owner immediately. She had so many questions, but her first question was why the owner had disguised himself as a homeless man, and his answer really moved her. John told her his sad story in that since he had been diagnosed with an incurable disease, he only had a few months left to live and wanted to dedicate his final months to give a better life to good-hearted people. But what he said afterward, the girl had never dared to dream of, since the girl was the only one who treated him as a human. He made a well-considered but far-reaching decision about the future of his He wanted his legacy to be in the hands of a good person and decided to give the ownership of all of his restaurants to the girl. The girl couldn't believe what he just told her and was so happy. After years of having to struggle with money, she now knew that her future was secure. She wanted to give something back, but because of John's disease, it would become a race against the clock. Although it was a sad thing that he only had a few months left, John was happy and reassured that his legacy fortune would fall into the hands of a good. He went home very satisfied. However, soon this positive feeling would come to an abrupt end. A few months later, John sadly passed away and the girl became the proud owner of all the restaurants. Although she struggled in the beginning with the great responsibility that rested on her shoulders, she managed to expand the restaurants even further. But this was not the most important thing. Most importantly, she taught all her staff from dishwashers to managers to be respectful of every kind of person, of every social class, exactly the way John would have always wanted it to. And in addition, she expanded the business with something that would make John incredibly proud. She founded a restaurant where homeless people could get a small meal for free every. She did this as a tribute to John and also as a thank you for all he has given to her. Without him, she wouldn't be where she was today, and she wouldn't have learned the most important lesson of her life. The restaurant for homeless people ran very well, and soon she was able to expand to other cities. She received a lot of praise for the good work she did, and it gave her satisfaction, and this was not the only good thing that her new work brought her while setting up her new restaurants. She had met a nice man. His name was Bobby, and he was a project manager. They were in touch through work, and she began to like him more and more. They saw each other more and more outside of work, but she didn't know about his past yet, even though they had been on many dates such as eating out or going to the movies together. Bobby had not yet gathered the courage to be honest with her about his past. He did want to be honest and open to her, but he was ashamed of it. Finally, one evening he had gathered all his courage to tell her after cooking for her. He asked if she would sit down for a moment because he needed to be honest with her. At first, of course, it startled her and she didn't know what to expect, but everything would soon become clear. Bobby began by admitting that he had not been completely honest with her. Currently, he was working as a project manager, as she knew, but this is not what he did before. In fact, before he had a completely different life that could not be compared to his current one. In fact, before he started working as a project manager, he was homeless because of some bad decisions he had made in the past. He had been wandering the streets for 2 years, but eventually he improved his life and became successful. He was afraid that she would see him differently. Now, the moral of this story and the lesson that we learned is that you always have to be nice to all sorts of people. As a wise man said, never look down at anyone unless you are helping them up. This story proves that niceness is always rewarded in the end. What did you think of this story? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, like the video and subscribe. See you next time.